Today, for the last class, we're talking about religious syncretism and the definition of religion. Religious syncretism means the synthesis of parts of two or more religions to produce a distinctly unique tradition known by its own name. And there are many examples of religious syncretism. Religious syncretism can come about in a number of different ways. It can happen when you have a new religion coming into an area, a new religion that people convert to, but which doesn't completely displace the native indigenous beliefs of that region. So, Vedic Hinduism moving into India, becoming the dominant religion, but absorbing many local beliefs and customs. Hindu Tantra is an outcome of this kind of religious syncretism, is a prime example of this. It can involve the conscious redeployment of religious scripture or practices to serve new purposes. Rastafarianism, which I'll talk about in a second, is a good example of this. Rastafarianism takes aspects of Christian belief and passages from the Bible to combine them with native African and some invented traditions to create a whole new religion in Jamaica. And lastly, religious syncretism can happen when you have a single charismatic leader who consciously fuses two old religions to create a new religion and maybe even gives it a name. So Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism is a combination of Hinduism and Islam, is the prime example here. Santeria and Voodoo are forms of religious syncretism that involve the combination of West African beliefs imported to the Caribbean as a result of the slave trade being combined with Roman Catholicism. Santeria is practiced in Cuba, and Voodoo is the official religion of Haiti, where the beliefs of the Fon and Iwe tribes of Nigeria were incorporated into Roman Catholicism during the French colonial period. In truth, Santeria and Voodoo are two examples of a kind of religious syncretism that we find all throughout the Latin American world. If you go to Mexico, South America, Central America, you find all over the place certain local indigenous deities who have two names or two personas. These are pre-existing Native American gods who are identified with various saints of the Roman Catholic Church. So they might have two names. They might go by the name of one of the saints of the church, but when they're represented in a picture or an icon, a statue, they look totally different. They look just like some native god of South of Central America. This kind of local religious syncretism is so common that in most places it doesn't even have a name. It's just, these are just local versions of how Roman Catholicism is practiced. Syncretism of this sort is why you have holidays like Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead in Mexico, which traces all the way back to an Aztec festival celebrating the goddess Micteca. In Haiti, the origins of voodoo, or voodoo in French, go back to the 17th century when slaves were brought from West Africa, the area of Nigeria, to work in the French colony there. King Louis XIV passed a law called the Code Noir, literally the Black Law, not a lot of subtlety there, which had a major impact on the way that slaves could practice their religion. It outlawed the practice of African religions among slaves, so their native religious traditions that they grew up with, and it mandated that all slaveholders in Haiti convert their slaves to Roman Catholicism within 8 days of their arrival in the colony. So the issue is that with a law like this, you can regulate certain things. You can regulate where people go to worship, whether they can build shrines or temples to their traditional gods and goddesses. You can regulate the kinds of books and things that people print, and you can even regulate whether or not slaves are able to read. But one thing that you can't regulate is what's actually going through people's minds when they are in a church or at an altar worshiping an authorized saint of the Catholic Church. You can't regulate what's actually going on in someone's mind. And voodoo developed as enslaved people came to identify the saints of the church as being identical to the gods and goddesses that they knew from their own tradition. So when people were worshiping St. Patrick, really they were seeing St. Patrick as Damballa, the creator god of Fon and Iwe religion, the lord of planets and the primordial creator of all life, a male god with a snake for a body. And why do you think it is that Damballa is identified with St. Patrick? Well, St. Patrick is a saint of the church known for kicking the saints out of Ireland, right? So there's some natural surface level association there. Ogu, who is the god of blacksmithing and by extension also war, because blacksmiths are the ones who make swords, was identified with Saint James the Greater. Erzule Freda, mother of the earth and goddess of love, is identified with the Virgin Mary, and in ceremonies worshiping her, people get possessed by the loa of the deity. That is, people think that the gods and goddesses can actually go into the bodies of other people and animate them. So in these ceremonies worshiping Erzula Freda, she can possess men and women, and she can flirt with people of either sex when she's doing this. Rastafarianism involves the combination of traditional African beliefs with Christian ones. Rastafarianism originates with activist and author Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican, the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, advocating that formerly enslaved peoples of the Americas return to Africa. So Marcus Garvey is the founder of the Back to Africa movement, who in 1928 wrote a play called The Crowning of the King and Queen of Africa, in which the final scene had a coronation of a new king of Africa, in which the film ends saying, "Look to Africa, when a king is crowned, know that your hour of redemption is at hand." Another Jamaican, Leonard Howell, a follower of Marcus Garvey, spread the idea that Garvey was a prophet because 2 years after Garvey's play was released, Haile Selassie was crowned the king of Ethiopia. Selassie claimed descent from the original line of Solomonic kings of ancient Israel. He presided over the transition of Ethiopia into a modern nation and was regarded by members of the Rastafarian movement as the Messiah returned on earth, the second coming, an African Jesus. Rastafarianism is derived from Selassie's birth name. So before he became king, he was Ras Tafari Makonnen. Ras means prince, and Tafari Makonnen is his given name. So Ras Tafari. With the earliest Rastafarians, followers of Marcus Garvey like Leonard Howell, growing their beards out to look like Emperor Selassie and creating their own reinterpretation and extension of Christianity. Rastafarians taught that enslaved people brought to the Americas had been exiled from Africa in the same way that the Jewish people were repeatedly exiled from their promised land. Those of you who listen to Bob Marley hear the lyric about Babylon. The Babylonian exile was one of the big exiles from Israel in the mid-first millennium BC. And in Rastafarian vocabulary, Babylon represents the West or the Americas, where Africans had been traditionally enslaved. Jamaica didn't get independence from Great Britain until 1962 either. So the Rastafarian movement was still going on when Jamaica was a colonial property of England. When Rastafarians talk about Zion, so Zionism is the movement to get Jews back to Israel, this is their coded way of talking about Africa, or the need for people of African descent living in diaspora to get back to Africa, their native land, their own promised land, meaning that Rastafarianism takes the whole theme of exile and return, which is the central narrative theme of the history of the Jewish people, gets extended to a narrative about the need to return to Africa on the part of people of African descent living elsewhere in the world. The syncretistic element of Rastafarianism comes in the incorporation of traditional African imagery. In addition to growing their beards out like Haile Selassie, Rastafarians don't cut their hair so that they grow into dreadlocks. In traditional African societies, dreadlocks are worn by priests and represent wisdom. Rastafarians talk about dreadlocks as representing the snakes on the crown worn by North African kings, including the ancient kings of Egypt, the serpent resting on the forehead representing the wisdom of the ruler and the significance of the brain. Although Rastafarians don't drink alcohol or smoke cigarettes or drink coffee, shunning these things as tools of the white oppressor, tools of Babylon, Rastafarianism does sanction smoking marijuana. Leonard Howell also owned several marijuana plantations himself, so he had some stake in this. Howell and other Rastafarians looked to passages from the Bible, which they interpreted to mean that God had created marijuana as an important medicinal and spiritual plant. So neither of these passages refer to marijuana or ganja specifically, but this is how they were interpreted. This passage from Revelation is about a certain plant that yields its fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Despite their differences, voodoo and Rastafarianism, in their origins, are about empowering people of African descent. Voodoo and Santeria involve co opting Catholic saints and clandestinely continuing the worship of native gods of Africa in a covert way that slaveholders wouldn't immediately recognize. And Rastafarianism is about reinterpreting the Bible, extending Old Testament prophecy to the present day, saying that the Messiah had come again and he lives in Africa in a way that makes Africa out to be a kind of promised land for formerly enslaved peoples and ties into the whole Back to Africa movement, which wasn't something restricted to Rastafarianism, but would also play out in the 20th century United States also. From the time that Islam arrived in India in the 11th century, there was a tradition of thinkers who looked for commonalities between Hinduism and Islam. The tradition of the poet mystics of medieval India, Kabir, Namdev, Ravidas, who tried to make an equivalence between the God of the Quran, Allah, and the highest manifestation of God in Hinduism. For North Indians, usually this is Vishnu. This tradition of trying to reconcile Islam with Hinduism is something that would go all the way up to Mahatma Gandhi, who declared in Hindi that Ishvara Allah Tera Nam, or that Ishvara, the God of Hinduism, and Allah are both of the same name. Really, the God of the Hindus and the God of Muslims is one God. The one official religion, or the one religion that gets a chapter in a world religions textbook that comes out of this kind of syncretistic enthusiasm, is Sikhism. Sikhism is born in the late 15th century in the Punjab region, which today straddles Pakistan, a majority Muslim state, and India, a majority Hindu nation. Sikhism is founded by Guru Nanak, a contemporary of Martin Luther in Europe. Guru Nanak is born a Hindu in a small town that is now in Pakistan. He's raised a traditional Kshatriyan Hindu, but his biographers tell us was unsatisfied with his native religion. So when he's 13 years old and he undergoes this thread ceremony, it's the ceremony that all caste Hindus have to wear a thread under their shirt. It's kind of something equivalent to like a bar mitzvah in Judaism. When the priest puts the upanayana thread on Nanak, he tears it off and he says that he wants a thread that will never tarnish, a thread that would never break or get lost. And later on at age 33 has this mystical experience where he goes into a river to wash himself and is swept away in a whirlpool for 3 days. Guru Nanak hears a disembodied voice which asks him, "How does one praise my name?" Recite. Recite Iqra is, by the way, the command in Arabic that Muhammad hears just as God begins to dictate the Quran to him. So a Muslim audience is going to understand Guru Nanak's story in this context. Guru Nanak passes the test by reciting a hymn in his native language of Punjabi. So it sounds much nicer in Punjabi, but it proves to the voice, which turns out to be the voice of God, that Guru Nanak is a great enough poet to transmit God's new revelation and message. God's revelations through Guru Nanak are the first part of the Sikh holy book, the Guru Granth Sahib, the central message of which is this verse, the Japji, which occurs over 100 times throughout the Guru Granth Sahib. And it is the statement that there is one God whose name is truth, the creator, without fear, without hate, eternal being, beyond birth and death, self-existent, and realized by the Guru's grace. The motto of Sikhism in the Punjabi language is Ik Oankar. One Ik God Oankar there is. Whereas a Muslim would say that God is Allah or Rahim, and a Hindu would say that God is Ishvara or Vishnu or Shiva, a Sikh would say that God is both Ishvara and Allah, both Rama and Rahim. That the God that Hindus worship and the God that Muslims worship is in fact the same. That God may have appeared in partial form on earth many times before, as in Vishnu and Rama and Krishna and Shiva. God has many theophanies or physical manifestations that we can see, flesh and blood manifestations that we can see. But that this doesn't mean that God in his full form is limited to any of his one embodied appearances on earth. Sikhism is then a kind of inclusive monotheism. God is all kinds of things. He might come to earth in a human form. He might present himself as various theophanies, as the writing on the wall or the burning bush. We don't, according to Sikhs, misidentify God as being limited to any one of his various theophanies or physical appearances, whereas Islam is a kind of exclusive monotheism, saying that if we treat any one appearance of God as being God himself, then we are making the mistake of reducing God to just that. For exclusive monotheist, God is too great to describe, so we don't call any of his manifestations on earth what Hindus would call avatars or avataras as being God. That would be overly reductive for Muslims. Guru Nanak's conclusion, and the thing that he emerges after 3 days out of the river saying, is that the only way to get past their differences which also resulted in ongoing conflicts, still ongoing conflicts between Hindus and Muslims, that each would have to recognize that the God they worship is in fact the same principle. And Guru Nanak says Hindus and Muslims will have to give up their rigid identities as members of different religions. His proclamation is that there is no Hindu, there is no Muslim. There are only those who worship God, and God is one. The word Sikh in Punjabi means a student or a seeker of the truth which is to be found in all religions. The one thing that makes Sikhism really unique is that after the death of Guru Nanak's last successor guru, so after the Sikh holy book was finished and the revelations was finished, the book containing the revelations of the gurus was itself considered the 11th teacher, the 11th guru of the Sikh religion. So the Guru Granth Sahib, when it's taken out of the temple on festive occasions, is treated as if it were a living, auspicious, holy person, and is giving all the honors that a king or a guru would be. Is that Sikh men have a prescribed mode of dress. So these are things that distinguish them from Hindus and Muslims, including you're supposed to actually wear a dagger, and Sikhs in India will still do this. And also, Sikh men aren't supposed to cut their hair. So when you see someone wearing a turban in the US, they're probably a Sikh, not a Muslim. Sikhism is a syncretic religion because it combines aspects of Islam and Hinduism, including Hinduism's belief in reincarnation. So Sikhs believe that they'll be reincarnated. The idea that God has appeared in human form on earth. So the Hindu notion of avatars or avataras, along with Islamic ideas such as the succession of prophets and the idea of continued revelation by God through his messengers. One of your two optional final papers for this week is to consider how some sort of social phenomenon that we don't usually characterize as a religion has religious elements in it. So if we were doing this live in class, we would do an exercise where we brainstorm things that every religion has. And pretty much whenever I do this in class, students come up with more or less the same list. What are some things every religion has? What are some features that make a religion a religion? And people say, well, a God, a higher power, a holy book or a holy set of scriptures, some sort of moral commandments or rules of basic morality that tell you how to act, and some sort of cosmology or some sort of explanation of where we all fit in the grand scheme of the universe, how the earth came to be, what's going to happen at the end of time. And generally, everyone pretty much agrees that these are basic features of any religion. I also like to emphasize how, beyond these basics, belief in a higher power, scripture, morality, cosmology, religion also provides a source of meaning and a source of community for people. Religion doesn't just answer the how and what questions, but also the why questions. Why is life worth living? What does it mean to live a fulfilling and well-lived life? And here we can think about other kinds of social phenomena, worldviews, ideologies that, in a number of senses, fulfill criteria for what we might call a religious worldview. One example that I'm fond of is that of consumer capitalism, which seems to provide a great deal in terms of meaning and fulfillment for many people. Capitalism gives people a sense of purpose. What is the meaning of life? Well, make money. Consumer capitalism contains annual rituals. What's an example of a ritual of capitalism? Black Friday, I think, is a pretty good example. For many Americans, Christmas has been reduced to a kind of celebration and display of affluence, gift giving, and consumption. I would argue, too, that capitalism contains a theodicy. A theodicy is an explanation of why it is that bad things happen to good people, or a solution to the problem of evil. So, why is it that someone who's been a good person, who gives to charity, who works at the soup kitchen, who goes to church every day, suddenly gets cancer in their early 30s? I mean, how do we account for something like that? From a Western religious worldview, someone might say that, well, God has a plan for everyone. He wants the best for everyone. That this terrible thing that happened is just a part of God's plan, but that none of us know God's plan in its entirety. So we just have to accept that some good somehow will come out of this person having cancer, even if it's not immediately obvious to us how that is. A Hindu or a Buddhist would appeal to the law of karma to say, okay, well, this person is a perfectly good person, nice to everybody, never did anything wrong, got some terrible disease early in life. This is because they did something bad in a previous life. This is the fruition of their karma. So both of these things, the idea of God's plan, which is ultimately unknowable to us, and karmic retribution, are examples of theodicies, or accounts of how it is that bad things happen to good people. Free market capitalism has, I would argue, a kind of theodicy of its own. Free market capitalism tries to account for injustice, evil, inequality in the world, in large part by saying that reliance on the welfare state robs people of their ability to work hard and help themselves. The idea being that government handouts, the welfare state, makes you lazy and makes otherwise good people rely on the government for things that they shouldn't have to. So if we just got rid of government handouts, the world would be a more fair and equitable place, and people would be hardworking and more willing to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Although free market capitalism doesn't explain what happens to you after you die per se, I would argue that it does present a kind of opportunity for life after death in the form of charitable donations, leaving a scholarship or an endowment to a university, getting your name on a wing or a building. This is really immortality of a certain sort. It is ensuring that your name will have a legacy, that your name will live on in the form of charitable donations, if you've made enough money to give such a gift. Sociologist and historian Robert Bellah has spoken of American civil religion, in which the US Constitution takes on quasi scriptural form, where we put presidents' birthdays on the calendar along with other holy days, holidays, and in which rituals of state, like saying the Pledge of Allegiance or singing the national anthem, have a kind of hallowed or sacrosanct or religious ritual dimension to them. So one of your final paper options is to consider how things like sports enthusiasm, Kardashian fandom, and diet culture have religious dimensions to them. And I'm linking below 3 videos to watch that go along with the question prompt.